So Stu, man, so we've been chatting. Well, we've been chatting for many months, and we've been chatting a lot in the last day or two,
right,
about all kinds of things. I mean, I have so many things I want to jump in with you about Nostr, evolution. Where to begin? Maybe we could start. I'm curious. We were chatting with me a bit about this earlier. It seems like we both learned a lot from folks like Terence McKenna, Alan Watts. What?
That's a good place to start.
Yeah. What spoke to you about those guys? And why?
So
why
I'll
do you
say
like them?
this. So I think one of the most. This is probably the thing that aligns most with Nostr. One of the things that I think one of the most important things Terence McKenna ever said was the real secret of the world. The real secret of magic is that the world is made of words. And he has another point. I think it might be in a whole different talk, but he elaborates on this point. And he has this argument that, and for context, Terence McKenna was sort of like the grandfather techno-utopian, he was like EAC before EAC was a thing.
I love that.
But also he was somehow at the same time like a ethnobotanist. If you don't know who Terence McKenna is, do yourself a favor and Google Terence McKenna. Go on YouTube, search Terence McKenna.
He also had an excellent voice that sounds a lot like this.
They talk like this. Everything's part of a cosmic universal body.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
mushrooms.
The mushrooms told me everything.
He was the fucking maniac in the best possible way. But anyways, he's that whole idea of the world being made of words. He had this argument that basically humans have been living in virtual reality. Virtual reality, it was a thing in the 90s. Everyone was virtual reality was before the current VR thing, there was a wave of this 20 years ago when everyone thought that we were all going to be living in virtual reality. And his point was, we've actually been living in virtual reality for about 5,000 years, well, or even longer.
Yeah.
Ever since the invention of language, humans have been living in virtual reality. It's a linguistically prescribed virtual reality because you're living in a world of symbols, and you're inhabiting primarily a symbolic reality rather than the world as such. And this is where he aligns really well with Alan Watts, because that's pretty much what you could probably boil Alan Watts' entire thesis down to, is the man suffers primarily because of the unintentional substitution of the symbolic for the real. Yeah. And so Terence McKenna put that in way more techno schizo terms of basically he's saying if you look at things through that lens, you realize that the world is much more malleable than it seems on the surface, because you're making the whole thing up, actually. And this is really interesting. I think Nostr is probably the most concrete embodiment of this idea of the world being made of words that we've built yet, because Nostr is the closest thing to an ecological system of fungible social data. Interoperability is directionally pointing toward a kind of fungibility. It's a kind of creating almost like a model of this world that is actually able to be composed into other things in the same way that DNA composes itself into a whole bunch of different forms. Nostr is in some way taking Terence McKenna literally and saying, okay, let's take you completely literally and say, okay, the world is made of words. Let's make these words, a little standardized format, an event, A Nostr event is the atomic unit of this world that Terence McKenna is talking about. So that's why I think the ecological lens is maybe the most underrated lens. People have talked about social media, ecologies for a long time, but the ecology has always been kind of a term of art. It never really has, no one has actually taken this seriously and gone okay, yeah, what are the things that an ecology has? What are the fundamental, abstract, ultra generalizable principles that lead to the kind of complexity creating processes, So there's a lot there. There's a lot to, there's a huge, that's like a super high surface area idea that you could go a million different directions on, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And I was going to say, I have a million different questions for you. One place, before we get into the Nostr ecology and evolution point, which I definitely want to touch on, is I want to pause on this idea that the world is made of language. Because this is an idea that I've come back to many times. From Terence, I mean, for many people, like in fact, all the way back into the Bible itself, right?
Yeah.
The beginning was the Word.
The Word was with God.
The Word was with God, and it was God.
Right.
And I've been thinking, on different levels or dimensions, this can make sense. So, in one level, it makes total sense what you're saying, that language is a virtual reality. It's an abstract reality.
Right.
And, in that sense, you can almost think of, we have, call it base layer 0 or dimension 0, which is this physical reality.
Right.
And then we have what some people have called like the new sphere or the mental dimension,
right,
where that's a virtual reality. That's okay. So that's a different layer on top of this. That's one way the language there.
Right.
And language in that layer 1 can impact layer 0 because I communicate symbols to you. I say, hey, Stu, bring me this stick.
Absolutely.
You reach over, you bring me the stick. Okay, so
yes,
layer 0 got manipulated.
Yes.
And that's very interesting to me. But then in some ways, there's still something prior or more fundamental to language in that interpretation. Now, in a different interpretation, you could take that language, the world is made of language, to go even deeper, right? And you could say, well, no, actually, it's not just that abstract reality. Maybe it's like language at every level, all the way up and down. And so then you could say, well, to your point with DNA, it's like, no, actually, us as physical beings, we were just language, like we were just the code of DNA that itself, was synthesized in this material reality.
Right.
What do you think, or even deeper, or even down to like?
Yeah, I think what that's pointing at is the relativity of abstractness and concreteness. And as far as I can tell, abstract and concrete are relative terms. Like most people would say, like to kind of like set up this thought experiment, like most people would say like, here's like a coffee cup. Is a coffee cup concrete or abstract? Well, a coffee cup is an object. It's a concrete thing. I can see it. You can see it. I can pick it up. I can manipulate it. Okay, so that's a concrete thing. It's made of atoms. Okay, yeah, right. Okay, so what about, the United States? Is that concrete or abstract? Well, it's an abstract idea, right? Okay, so that is because, so I'll formulate this. I think what it is concisely the things that we consider, like what is abstract and what is concrete depends on your point of view. Specifically, it depends upon whether you are composed of or whether you compose the thing you're talking about. So like from your perspective, from the perspective of your body, from the perspective of biology, a molecule is a very concrete thing. But from the perspective of an atom, a molecule is an abstraction. Because a molecule is just an arrangement of atoms.
Right.
Another way of saying that is from the perspective of, from the perspective of you, the government is an abstract thing, but from the perspective of the government, you're a concrete thing. Because the government is, in a democracy, is supposedly composed of people. Or like, so there's a kind of a stack in which there's nested structures that the things that go into composing something are considered concrete from the perspective of the thing that they're composing, and then the things that you're composed of are considered concrete because they're non-negotiable in a sense. Because like it would be like taking like a prior block out of the blockchain or something. Yeah. Like this is something I've always thought about before, is that reality kind of is a blockchain. Like history is a blockchain in the sense that like you can't just take things out of it. Like the Beatles are concrete. Because if you took the Beatles out of the timeline, it would rewrite tons and tons and tons of stuff. Many things depend upon the Beatles existing and that are living in the world that the Beatles created because of their presence in the timeline. Whereas things that are hypothetical, that haven't yet existed, you can remove those things from reality and it doesn't affect anything that already exists. So to your question about like whether I think everything is language, ultimately, like it's just language written in different substrates, where you have biology, which is written in the language of chemistry, and then you have chemistry, which is written in the language of quantum physics, and you have quantum physics, which is written in the language of, I don't know, I guess string theory or some bullshit. Like, I'm kind of bearish on string theory for other reasons, but let's just say string theory as a precursor, as a placeholder, I should say. But I mean, yeah, you know, all models are wrong. Some are useful. To the extent that that's a useful way to look at it, I think it is language all the way down.
Yeah.
Everything is like, matter is really just a term of convenience. Matter really is form. The more if you zoom in far enough, everything is form. But like, it doesn't really matter because form is concrete. Form is extremely concrete.
What's interesting to me there,
Ultimately. Yeah.
So that's interesting that form is concrete. One thing that you sparked in me is another way of saying language is information.
Yeah.
Because what we're saying here is information is a way to arrange the smaller building blocks, whatever they are. So if it's atoms
Right.
to build a molecule, molecules to build whatever, all the way up to the organ systems,
Right.
and whatever. So in some sense, the information, the language that organizes the building block that came below it. But then do you think there was like a primordial building block, or like literally just it's all the way down? Like you just can keep going deeper and deeper, and there's always some information that's like was when the Bible says in the beginning was the Word, like was information the first thing?
I have no idea, to be honest.
Me neither.
I have no clue, man. I feel like to the limits. I mean, it's difficult for me to understand. It's difficult for me to imagine what a truly concrete thing, like what is even meant by that.
Yeah.
Really, like, I mean, empirically, if you zoom in far enough, you just see probability distributions. So there seems to be something a bit squirrely about nature when you try to pin it down.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like what we were talking about yesterday briefly. You mentioned like, yeah, so like even if the universe is a simulation, like what does that even really mean to say that? Like, of course it's a simulation, but why? That doesn't mean it isn't real.
Right.
Simulations are real. Simulations are part of reality.
100%.
Like, there isn't a really, there, you know, maybe when you say simulation, you mean some kind of like contrived subdivision of reality where only a subset of things that are otherwise real are permissible. In that sense, a simulation is a kind of cage or something, like a computer. But like, yeah, physics is it's a physics engine. Physics is a computational. I mean, well, so Stephen Wolfram has a lot to say about this, actually.
Oh yeah, what does he say?
Well, he has this book. He has this whole. I haven't read this book, so I don't fully understand. But Stephen Wolfram has this new kind of science thing where he has this entire. He thinks that he's. And I have no idea if he's telling. I don't know if he's actually like Stephen Wolfram is like. I have no idea if he's absolutely insane or if he's like the next Einstein. But he basically thinks that he's like completely reinvented physics on the basis of cellular autonoma.
Okay.
And that there's like the way of like rebuilding all physical laws that kind of fall out of like cellular autonoma, and who knows. But I do think he has some pretty good points about like this notion of irreducible complexity.
Okay.
That like the structures that exist, like the reason we have like atoms and molecules and stuff like that are because those in some way represent like the most bulletproof way of doing things. That like after like when after the Big Bang or whatever, there was a kind of like state change where energy organized itself into a kind of stack where you had, and like to me that is so intuitively obvious because everything else works that way, that you're going to have like atoms are local minima, molecules are local minima, biological systems are attempting to maintain local minima through the process of homeostasis. Even human societies are attempting to find local minima, except we're not doing it in terms of energy, we're doing it in terms of other things that are analogous and kind of serving as a stand-in for energy. But the pattern is the same, is that everything is seeking local minima. And of course, a stack is a way of layering things so that you can have domains in which local minima are actually achievable. And you see this with Bitcoin too, is that like every complex system eventually, particularly systems that need to find consensus, it ultimately arrives at layers. So if you want to generalize this to make it completely unsaleable, you say you say it's layers all the way down. Well, no shit, Sherlock.
Yeah.
Of course it is. You know, it doesn't really tell you much in terms of like nature, because like what the hell is a layer? But you know, I guess that's depends on your model. But
Well, I mean, and I think it was, I forget who I read this with some years ago. This idea of holon theory, that everything is part and whole all the way up and all the way down, which is another way of saying layers, but another way of saying what you're saying, that you have these individual parts that cluster together with some kind of information, basically figuring out how to organize, and then all the way up, all the way down forever.
yeah, kind of nestedness. But Nostr is pretty fascinating because we're creating like we're building. I can't remember if I told. Have I mentioned this idea to you that I think that Nostr is like an extension of the biosphere?
No, but let's go.
That like if you think about like a bird, okay, a bird's body, a bird has feathers and like a beak and scales and feet or whatever, and like if you said like where did those feathers and beak and blood and bones and stuff come from? It's like obviously it's the bird's DNA because it's the bird's body. Okay, yeah, of course, right. What about the bird's nest? Is that part of the bird's body? Well, kind of, in the sense that it is encoded for by the DNA of the bird,
Right.
but it's just made out of like grass or something. It's not like strictly like bird. So, but like from a modeling perspective, that nest is like an extrasomatic adaptation. It's part of the bird's body in a information, in a computational sense. It is part of the bird. So humans are kind of doing that in a super hyper scale way, because we have a layer 2 in which to simulate the synthesis of these extrasomatic adaptations. So we, humans don't have wings, so we create Boeing 747s,
Wow.
which are
Not sure we'll hop on the Boeing right now. But
Boeing 737 Max.
yeah, exactly.
So we can fly like a bird
Yeah.
for a while.
For a while, yeah.
until the door panel blows
Yeah,
off.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, but in any case, we have the ability to. We've just kind of taken this extrasomatic adaptation to an extreme,
Yep.
and that's where we get this exponential, and that is pretty much all the myth of Prometheus, like the story of, this is again, we're going to be circling back to Terence McKenna here. The story of human civilization is the story of language. Mm-hmm. Language is using us. Language is the primary actor.
Right.
Humans are the substrate upon which language is carrying out its vision, and that's an interesting thing to think about. And I think that when you look at like cultures absolutely do have a kind of destiny baked into their DNA, that humans will be motivated according to, you can look at the 20th century and see this playing out like in spades. Like you can look around at the world today and you can see how things that happened in World War II or things that happened in the 19th century are still impacting the present because of the momentum of language. Like symbols in books live a lot longer than individual humans do.
Would you say, by the way, it's interesting you use
Yeah.
the word momentum. I've always associated the word momentum like with karma, and the idea that perhaps karma is linked to language, and that's like the idea of rebirth is the language rebirthing itself. And I don't know, this is something that just came into my mind right now.
I mean, I guess the question, is this like the Akashic Records? Is there like
Potentially.
Is there a space in which this language is inscribed?
Well, I think there's two ways you can look at it. One way is that, which is there like an actual dimension? Like to that question, I've always thought to myself, like, where does language live? Like we're talking right here,
yeah.
like we're speaking, but there's when I actually speak to you from the physical dimension, there's that Bowery Electric album I love, where the song continually says, "Words are only noise," and that's true. Words are only noise. It's just noise.
Right.
But yet, then there's the meaning imbued with them. And so where does that information live? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the Akashic Records. But I think there's also a more literal way of looking at that, which is to say, even in this dimension, you may die, but the language, the ideas that you propagated, that lives on. That's been infected. It's like software into new human hardware, potentially now new inanimate hardware, with the rise of computers,
because
internet and AI.
And because we've automated language now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And now potentially and okay, so here's an interesting question for you. Now, do you think that we've started automating language, and maybe it has its own karma or not, but do you think that it's going to become self-referential and somehow, I guess, now be able to loop back to that Akashic record dimension? Or, where do you think this next wave of AI and language is going to go?
I mean, I wish I knew more about AI, how it worked on a nuts and bolts kind of level.
Yeah.
I can only approach it from a kind of like surface empirical level. I think that the main limitation of AI is that, like, it's really, it's a model of language, and like, I think that the apparent intelligence of AI is due to the fact that it is modeling language specifically.
Yep.
Like, if you took a bunch of transformers and like trained them on a data set of like something that was not human language, you wouldn't find intelligence emergent from this system. It's because language is a way, it's like we use language to model intelligence, and then we used computers to model language. So by a large language model, ChatGPT is a model of intelligence.
Yes.
And because of that, both of those, every model, every layer is a bottleneck. And the main bottleneck, I think, is not the computer's ability to model language, but language's ability to model reality. And that is, I mean, maybe, again, I'm a little bit, there's a little bit of hopium in this for me, because I want there to be something special about humans, but I would like to believe that the world is kind of like an iceberg and language is the tip of it, and that computers only have modeled the tip of the iceberg because we as conscious actors have only modeled the tip of the iceberg with our words.
Agreed.
But we, for example, we have all this whole unconscious ocean of reality that only certain humans, namely artists, are able to model, kind of. And and the ones who are good at it get paid a lot of money because we clearly have a drive to model those things that no one else has modeled.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because when we started this conversation, we were talking about how Terence McKenna says the world is made of language. And so what's interesting to me there is, we have this conscious language, and that is clearly, in my mind, I agree with that it's to the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
LLMs are great, but as a lot of AI experts seem to think that until we get the ability to build embodied intelligence and take in sounds and touch.
And they can have their own experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at some level, if the McKenna thesis is right, then that's language too. And so one question that I have is I wonder if large language models could eventually, well, I guess the map is never the territory, so we'll never be able to model everything because it's within that. But if we can get pretty damn close, we just need to be able to access more kinds of language. And so maybe that's, for example, being able to apply this one day to DNA and to genetic code. If that's being able to, better map sensory inputs as language, which I don't know if that's even.
Oh yeah, no. I mean,
it's
pretty clear that transformers are able to model things. That's almost like a whole nother thing. Is like, okay, so if we can model language this well, we can also probably model a lot of other things with using this same method that are going to give us not a large language model, but a large something model.
But it's still language.
It's still language.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's symbolic.
Symbolic representation.
Symbolic representation of something. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe you could create a model of like a beehive or something, or you could create a model of like whatever the hell ants are doing, or maybe what enzymes are doing, or something like that. There's people that have taken, like radiology scans and fed them into transformers and came up with AI that can diagnose tumors. So that's not human language per se. I mean, people, like look at DALL-E, look at image generation.
Right.
So I think it's quite obvious that the transformers are much more general than human language, but a large language model is a special case because it's a kind of model of reality that we can interact with in the language that we speak, and so therefore it's highly useful for us.
Yeah.
We can write computer code with this. I don't know. Maybe if you took like Neuralink might open up a whole new thing where you start just running transformers on just thoughts, and that's pretty terrifying, honestly.
It's extremely.
I don't trust I think the state of the world. I would like to get to a state of greater guarantees about privacy, liberty, sovereignty before that technology arrives. And of course, I don't have a choice. I'm just hoping. I'm hoping that decentralization systems get a little more advanced before that technology becomes possible.
Yeah.
Personally.
So I 100% agree
Yeah.
with that, and I'm sure that'll segue us back to Nostr. But
Right.
one sort of philosophical question I always have on the privacy debate.
Yeah.
In general, I 100% agree that if any central authority has the ability to like read and censor your speech, then that's obviously going to prevent, you know, creativity and evolution from playing its full course, and that's very dangerous.
Right.
There's a Stallman essay I was reading as like a part of like
Mm-hmm.
book of old cyberpunk essays, and it just kind of plays this out to its extreme. Like, what happens if you're no longer allowed to read books if you're caught reading someone else's book, and
Right.
and like that kind of totalitarian world is terrifying to me.
Right.
On the other hand, in the sort of dream scenario, well, I think privacy is a necessary tool in this current iteration of society.
Right.
In the dream scenario, I've also been I'm increasingly a fan of this idea of radical honesty, of just like, you know, imagine how much simpler your life is, and frankly better if you have no secrets, if everything is just out in the open. Now, obviously that can be, you know, extremely manipulated, and it's kind of like the story you were telling me when you lived in Finland, and the Finnish, you know, are trusting, and in a high trust environment that kind of works.
Yeah.
But if someone comes in and exploits and doesn't share the same values, then
Right.
they fuck over everyone else.
Right.
Maybe it's something similar here, where in a world where everyone truly is, I don't know, trying to lead the most, I don't know what you would want to call it, pure, authentic, least, one way of saying this would be the life that lets energy flow the most, because you're not at all trying to censor anything.
Right.
That seems to me like an ideal, but perhaps I don't really see a path to living that way when you still have, I guess, centralized control that can do something malicious with that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, I think on some level, you have to have, like, you have to have the ability to choose. Like, I think in some level, privacy is kind of inseparable from diversity, because, like, if you don't have the ability to have secrets, then it's going to be hard to come up with novel ideas, because almost like by definition, well, actually by definition, every new idea is initially unpopular, because popular ideas are by definition ideas that are held by the majority. And so I think that there's probably the optimum amount of censorship in society is not zero. It's just a question of who is doing the censorship, whether you have censorship through decentralized, you have decentralized censorship, or you have centralized censorship. And yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of like, a lot of things are like that, like property rights are like that, or like national borders are like that. Like if you decentralize borders completely, you end up with property rights. Or if you centralize borders, you end up with states dictating imaginary lines that people are arbitrarily not allowed to walk across, which is kind of a non-optimum situation, because it creates, there's a lot of injustice in that kind of generalization.
Right.
So I think similarly with censorship, there's a tremendous amount of injustice in someone else being allowed to decide for other people what you get to say and what you don't. But I think when, just like individual property rights, if you have individual people being allowed to say what they want to say and what they don't want to say, that's essential. And I think it would be a far less interesting world if everyone's thoughts were constantly on display.
Yeah.
Because maybe it says something about there's some content in whether or not someone chooses to share something or not.
Yeah.
Like if you don't have people you trust, there really, like, if you don't not trust some people, there's really no such thing as someone you trust. Like, those two concepts are
Mutually rising.
If you don't have enemies, you don't have friends.
Yeah.
And I didn't used to think that way, but I definitely kind of start thinking that way now. Like, I don't know. I think there's a certain amount of conflict inherent in human society.
Just being alive.
Yeah, it's just like whether that conflict is like productive enough, whether it allows room for experimentation and failure, or it is like kind of like afraid to do that and just trading all of that uncertainty for a kind of imagined consistency of everyone being on the same page until some kind of crisis comes and breaks the illusion.
Well, and
yeah.
I think to your point, and you know, I definitely am very much on the side, at least in the current way the world works, of giving as many tools to the individual to protect their thoughts as possible. Because I also think that some of the benefits I was trying to get out with this radical honesty idea only work if it's selectively shared. Like
Right.
if you've chosen, you know, to try and live a life of complete truth,
Right.
but it's not complete truth, and it's not authentic, and it's not from a place of love or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
If you're forced into that, if you're coerced, then you haven't made the choice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Radical honesty is only possible when you assume voluntary opt-in consent. Yeah. Otherwise, you don't even you don't leave the room for forcing someone like you better be radically honest.
Exactly. It sounds pretty funny.
You don't right.
So jumping with that a little bit, I mean, I think, you know, we've touched a bit on Nostr, and now we're starting to talk about, you know, the idea of some decentralized, you said censorship, maybe another way of saying that is like what we were talking about earlier, some of the decentralized trust or the web of trust thing.
Right.
Maybe as a jumping off point there, you know, you mentioned you think that Nostr is the right substrate to build this new, I don't know, I guess, set of building blocks for human / whatever computer organism. Why do you think this is the right building block to build that ecosystem? And how do you think that's going to organize in this sort of web of trust that you've talked about?
I think it's the right building block because it positions humans as effectively the scarce resource of the system. Because like, if you're building applications, the thing you need is users. You need humans to voluntarily use your thing. You of course you could do the Amazon Mechanical Turk. You could spin up a bunch of AIs or something to emulate humans, but really, the economic and social value of a thing is proven by the ability to get people to opt into your system because you've created the possibility for some positive sum interaction between humans. And that is the value you've added to the system. And it's very unclear how to judge that value without testing it. And what Nostr allows people to do is permissionlessly test the implementation of systems that allow for positive sum games without having to delete all the social capital that has been accumulated and all the lessons that have been learned every time your system fails. The same is true with an ecosystem. The reason why squirrels can exist is because there's a tremendous amount of history built up, encoded in their DNA about all the experiments that didn't work. Like, in some ways, the incredible harmony and stability and resiliency of life is born out of a kind of distilled essence of death, where like thousands, trillions, quadrillions of generations and failed experiments have proscribed the negative, like in negative space, the image of what works. And so similarly, and the crucial thing is that when an organism reproduces, it doesn't have to give up all its progress. It gets to checkpoint itself.
Right.
And so it's kind of saved a kind of state. And that's what that's one of the things that makes Nostr different, is that when Nostr is very new, so we haven't seen this yet, but Nostr will probably go through generations of apps in the same way that Web 2 has, except when it does that, each successive generation will be starting on a much higher level of organization, in the same way that squirrels are on a higher level of organization than, like the first paramecium in the primordial ooze or whatever it was, because he doesn't have to go back to square one. Whereas like with Web 2, it's like dig, migrate to Reddit. Reddit, now migrate to Discord. Discord, okay, we don't know what's going to be next, but something, hopefully Satellite. Or whatever, or Stacker News or something. Probably Stacker News, to be honest. Reddit, eventually, as long as Stacker News publishes all of its Nostr events, someone else can start a thing stand on the shoulders of giants, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the thing, and science is an ecological system because it has science, at least before peer review, was a permissionless system where people could publish things, they could cite each other's work, and they can build on the things that came before. And so Nostr is a fungible, interoperable, at least as long as relays remain operable, a permanent kind of sort of Akashic record implemented in silicon, as it were, of the world's knowledge and information, and the web of trust, which is probably the most important composable thing that can be distilled from all the interactions on Nostr. So that's why I think the ecological lens is correct.
I mean, in that sense, I mean, it sounds like all open source is kind of like that.
Absolutely.
All open source.
Open source, Linux, 100%. Except Nostr is like not only open source, it's like open data.
Yeah.
It's open asset.
Exactly.
Open relation. It's because social relationships don't live in a GitHub repo. They live in the real world.
Right.
And Nostr is a model of the things that are in the real world. The relationships between humans are extremely high signal.
And what's very exciting to me, so I love all of that. I've always loved that open source. I didn't necessarily phrase it in the same way, but that ability to checkpoint to, any project that contributes to open source, it's a win for their society. Any company, whether that company wins or loses, there's still new experiments that are tried.
Yes.
And that's what evolution is, right? Like, news experiments get tried, some work, some don't, but you always learn something.
Massive parallel iteration.
Massive parallel iteration. And the more parallelism there is, the more experiments that are being run, the better the less chance you stop at a local maximum, the more chance you actually reach a totally new, a new playing field. And so I've always loved open source for that reason. And I think that in the case of Nostr, I love this idea that you're just now applying relationships and data to it. And in theory, making the flywheel spin much faster, because now, you can also experiment with the code for a new app and the user base for a new app, and the user base grows with new app. Every new app that's successful in Nostr, because they're all interoperable, that's huge. And the web of trust that you can bring with it, that's huge. I think people are going to be shocked at how fast that flywheel spins when it does. But I also think that it's interesting because Nostr is what you say, it's trying to map the real world into the noosphere, but it's also building something brand new in the noosphere, which is two things. One, you can now add in something that doesn't exist in the real world, which is bots. And I actually think that's going to be extremely, like, as AIs get better and better and more like able to do interesting things, it's going to be like, well, actually, this thing that I'm interacting with, maybe it's a human, maybe it's not, maybe I don't care. I mean, like, for certain things, maybe I want to know. There's like a web of humans, and that really matters to me for, either aesthetic reasons or whatever reasons. But then there's also going to be this new world of like web of like whatevers, and I don't really care, but like I do trust whatever this bot is or this person on the other end of the keyboard. They're extremely good at giving me this data that I need. They're extremely good at giving me this feeling that I want, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's also very valuable. So now you have this new thing that's being built only in the noosphere. And then you have the kind of like stack or the layer on top of that, which is interestingly, I guess, why I named my fund Hive Mind, which is the emergent properties that now come out of not only the web of humans that already exists, but what happens when that can be modeled in silicon, mixed with other silicon in silicon, and remodeled again, and whatever the hell that new superorganism is. And I don't know what that's going to look like. What do you think?
I mean, you're kind of making me think that like Nostr is almost like a net that catches the value that's generated from the interactions of AIs with each other.
Yes.
Because these AIs are going to have web of trust as well.
100% they will.
Yeah. That's super interesting.
And by the way, I think one of the beautiful things with Nostr is, one of the reasons I'm most bullish on is its simplicity. It'd be hard to create a more simple identity and data transport system. Now, on the simplicity stage, you made this point. You said, okay, where does like one organism, in the case of the bird, begin?
Right.
And obviously it's somewhat amorphous because you can have sort of like theoretical or noosphere extensions. Like you can say, well, actually encoded in here was the future ability to connect with this other relay or whatever.
Right.
But you could also say, like, just like with the bird, actually no, the nest is not the bird. The bird ends at the physical organism, which is the wings and whatever.
Right.
And similarly, my guess is you can have those same debates in the Nostr noosphere, but the kind of like organism or molecular encasing or what's the word, membrane for that, is going to be a Nostr pub key. And maybe a year or so ago, maybe 8 months ago, I heard Drew Bansel, who I'm a big fan of and is thinking on AI, his thinking was, he was talking about sort of metabolic systems.
Mm-hmm.
We've had these long conversations, which we could touch on, about Bitcoin being sort of energy-backed money, which to me was a huge eureka. And so Drew's kind of point was that different AIs or organisms in this new sphere, the way to model their periphery or their, loose casing is going to be with a Bitcoin public key. And I thought that was a really good way of saying it, because then it's like, okay, with one Bitcoin public key, you're giving and receiving little bits of what I call digital ATP. As a nice
Adenosine
analogy.
triphosphate.
Exactly. That's one nice model that worked for me. But now, increasingly, I actually think it's going to be the Nostr pub key. Because I think, in the kind of the way Alby does it already, like your Nostr pub key can be your kind of master key for your identity, and then you can have Bitcoin accounts associated with that as well.
Yeah.
And I'm similarly very bullish on Nostr Wallet Connect right now as a way to sort of direct the different energy stores you have, i.e. Bitcoin wallets. But increasingly, my intuition is that your Nostr pub key, or something derived from it, is going to be the kind of like master identity for each of these different encasings, whether it's human, AI, or some combo.
Yeah, that sounds about right, because it would be pretty hard to make something that was more general than Nostr. Nostr is essentially a stitching together layer of a lot of different things. I've been thinking of it that way recently, that its primary function is discovery and kind of welding together and creating interfaces between various socially relevant data sets. So yeah, I mean, one's Bitcoin transaction history is a very important thing that Nostr can probably expropriate in some way and make usable. Like, Nostr is kind of like the universal interface to things that are to valuable data, and that's like actually you know DVMs, data vending machines.
Yeah.
Pablo's thing he came up with, where basically it's like just a kind of like just like a formalization, a proposal of how to have how to pay using like Lightning or eCash or something. Use microtransactions to pay people via Nostr to return data to you. And like I think that's like there's so many use cases like that illustrate how Nostr is really more like, it might look like an API, but really if it's an API to a market and the intelligence of a market. And that was something I was working on at the cohort in Madeira, was like thinking of like an example is like Satellite CDN is right now just a bucket, like an object storage bucket, where you give it a hash of a file and it serves the file to you from the bucket. But to using the DVMs and using Nostr, you could really build out a backend of a CDN, of Satellite CDN or any other CDN using Nostr, where if someone asks for a file and the CDN doesn't have that file in its object store, it can put out like a bounty almost to Nostr and say like, I'm willing to pay this much to the first person who uploads the file that has this hash so that I can serve it to my customer. And the customer, from their point of view, just sees a long-running GET request that maybe takes like 10 seconds or something. And in the background, you're just like kicking off a Ruby Goldberg machine. You're mobilizing an army of humans or AIs or other computers to like decide whether or not they're willing to, you're pretty much it's like a data bounty hunter, I think was the phrase I used in this in my slideshow for this. But anyways, I haven't implemented it yet, but it's a cool idea. Somebody should implement it. Somebody should implement a lot. I think anything that basically is like the intelligence of a market but made accessible with an API is like where Nostr really, really shines, because that's just not something that normal applications can do. Like that's an example of Nostr doing something that hasn't been possible previous. I had this thought a few weeks ago that like there's, in a conversation I was having with someone, there's really two kinds of Nostr apps right now. There's basically apps that are clones of existing things that are just like, like Reddit, but decentralized and censorship resistant. And then, or like YouTube except Nostr, or, like Reddit, or I already said that, but yeah.
Twitter.
but Nostr, right? Yeah. So that was the original thing that Nostr tried to clone was Twitter. But so that's like the first category is just like decentralized clone of centralized thing, and then the other thing is like something that we didn't even think. We never even considered because we didn't have the tools or the models to do this before. That's a whole other class of Nostr app, and like no doubt. I mean, I'm super bullish on all the decentralized clones of centralized things, but the things that are never possible before are maybe like the epochal defining things of the next generation. Things that there aren't even examples of to clone yet.
And I mean, I could not agree with you more than that. And as an investor, that's what gets me way more excited.
Yeah.
I mean, it's cool. Like, I mean, that's always, New York Times Online cool, Twitter way cooler.
Right.
How much of that? So I really like the way you say this. Like, Nostr it's the way to access market intelligence via API.
Yeah.
And that's fucking awesome. How much of that though is just the Bitcoin micropayment piece? Like, how much of that could we do with existing Web 2 apps plus just Bitcoin micropayments? Or is it, okay, we have the micropayments, plus it's the fact that because it's all on the data and the identities are all in one standard, you can just much easier like plug and play all these different components and build, like you said, the Goldberg machine that goes out 15 steps.
I think it's two. I think it's both of those things, and that's why we're only doing this now, is both of those micropayments and identities that are tied to some kind of reputation easily through the pub key are...
and also probably the data transmission, or just having a standard.
A standardized transport layer, relays, absolutely. A permissionless, standardized, interoperable transport layer, yeah. So there's a confluence of factors. It's obviously this is impossible. Web 2, the financial system right now, where you just like have like a minimum, like I don't know what a credit card transaction is, like 35 cents. Was it like 35 cents? So it sets like a minimum floor on the kind of transaction that you can really have. Otherwise, you're just throwing away money. So you can't have fast, sub 1 cent transactions, and that's a shame because, I mean, it's like Nostr is really set up to succeed because the current financial system is just blocking itself off from a lot of use cases. I think Nostr, it might end up being a marketplace after all. The original, Nostr was originally called Diagon Alley.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, it was built for, like a bunch of Lightning devs were like, hey, we should have a marketplace so we can like buy things with Lightning, and then evolved into a social network that now we have like Johnny-come-lately people like me that are like, hey, this would be useful for a marketplace. It's like, no shit.
Yeah.
Like, you just figured that out, huh?
Yeah.
So I'm not claiming that I'm looking back and seeing how silly it is every time I was like, yeah, people had this idea already, but it really speaks to the truth of it. I mean, I don't know. It's going to get really interesting when you start having like real world physical transactions on Nostr. I mean, I would love to have like I would love to be able to like source my things I actually need for my real life with Nostr. I mean, I would love if there was some kind of like local farmers market bullshit that you could use, like a marketplace for apples or something like that. That would be super cool.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So
yeah.
I've been bullish on marketplaces on Nostr for a while as well. And in fact, I mean, I have been able to work with and invest in Alan Bitts and Ben for a while. So I remember he was one of the first people that kind of turned me on to all this, and I remember he and Fiat Jaff, I guess, accidentally created Nostr the first time with Diagon Alley. And
the best things are created accidentally.
Yeah, wait a second, like this seems really fucking promising. But to your point, like the idea is not enough. Now we need thousands of developers trying shit and seeing what works. I've been trying to figure out though what's the first marketplace that's really going to pop. For a while I was thinking maybe it'll be local Bitcoins. I still think that's going to take off. Then maybe like a marketplace for like AI agents, somewhat similar to what Chris is doing at Open Agents, but I think eventually he'll make it Nostr based. I think it could be something obviously just like totally brand new, maybe like various data sources, with an API. But I this morning was talking to you a little bit about, I think this comes back to the web of trust stuff, like where a Nostr-based marketplace is going to really thrive. Well, one is the censorship-resistant thing, and maybe, but I have a sense it's probably going to be just some brand new use case more than just censorship resistance, where censorship resistance is necessary for it to be open and permissionless, but not like, we're just doing the dark web or something.
Right.
I think then micropayments might be an important piece of it, but then also reputation is a very important piece of it. And so one thing we were talking about this morning is Bob Scully and his new thing from Prism is essentially a Nostr-based marketplace for eCash mints.
Yeah.
And to me, that was like a big aha moment. I was like, oh shit, like you said, this is a free market for free banking. And but trust is super important. If you're going to trust someone to custody your funds, whether it's a bank or a person, probably eventually be banks.
Supremely important.
It's super fucking important.
Yeah.
And so this is probably the first app or marketplace I've seen where I'm like, okay, Nostr is uniquely the best substrate for this to be launched in because of reputation. Are you?
Well, yeah.
What do you think?
No, I mean, I think you're right. And like, additionally, it's due to the redundant, permissionless nature of relays. Because if you had a centralized backend, you don't know if that backend is intentionally omitting certain data from you. Because like, I think kind of a less obvious point about whether you can trust data, there's two things you need. You need digital signatures because you need to prevent people from being able to forge data. Like you need to prevent people from being able to forge a note saying that like, I trust this mint, right? But you also need to be able to prevent the source of data from deleting data that goes against some narrative it's trying to create. So like you could imagine if you had some sort of like corrupt trusted eCache ranking system, one way of making it corrupt is like just like putting in false reviews. Okay, well, digital signatures on Nostr prevent you from being able to create fake reviews because they have to be signed by a pub key that has some reputation otherwise associated with it. Okay, so Nostr solves that. But if you didn't have, but like with a normal backend, with a normal Web 2 kind of backend where you're just connecting to a single API, the other way to be corrupt is just to delete all the notes and not serve them from your database that go against the people you don't want to seem, you're trying to basically tip the scale against. So the fact that Nostr has this redundant, like every client pulls from like 5 or 6 different relays, where unless they all conspire to censor you, you're going to see the notes. That is like, that the redundancy is just as important as the digital signature because it protects from omission, lies of omission, as much as digital signatures provide protection from positive forgeries.
That's so true.
And so, yeah, I mean, Nostr, you're right, you're completely right. Nostr is an ideal substrate for this kind of like permissionless trust exposition,
And my guess, with that is that you're going to see something like maybe it's the mints or something else take off. And then I think what everyone's going to be shocked at, and it's hard to like predict exactly the timing of this, but is Nostr accrues network effects at the protocol level. And so, we've got call it a couple 100,000 people that have used the Twitter clones.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands that are using it weekly. And so, it's not a ton, but imagine if one of these mint things really takes off, for example, I don't know, in like a country that, the currency is failing in, and there's a couple of mints that really pop up, popular there, and then all of a sudden you get a couple 100,000 users. Well, now all of those people can use the Twitter clones, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you've got this huge new influx of users on the social media apps.
I mean, it doesn't guarantee that they all will,
No,
but
of course
but it will lower the barrier for them adopting it because they already have a Nostr identity. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Right.
so, and maybe it's not even going to be the social media apps, but eventually what's going to happen is they all get these interoperable identities that start, accruing social reputation. It's like, well, I use my Nostr identity to source my Bitcoin mint. But also now some enterprising, intelligent entrepreneur realized, hey, I can use that social capital to start my local Apple marketplace.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this is where I
Right.
just think things are going to spin up. It's hard to predict
Yeah.
exactly the timing, but way faster than people realize. Because
Yeah.
once you have this, like, call it, your final identity, like obviously you'll hopefully be able to rekey and have sub-identities and all that stuff. But like, you now can access everything that comes after.
Right.
And I don't know if it's going to be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, but I think people are going to be shocked once it starts running at how fast it can run.
Yeah, I really like the idea of, that is a very interesting thing, if the idea that you'll have a kind of publicly addressable web of trust that lowers the activation energy, as it were, necessary to start local businesses.
Yes.
So like, even though this web of trust is probably going to be built in a global context, if Nostr reaches a state of development where, like, for instance, there's 100 Nostr users in the city of Chico. Okay, currently there's like 2.
Yeah, I was about to say.
So we only need
Ambitious.
we only need 1 order of magnitude increase to reach 100. So
Let's go.
if we do that, then maybe I don't know, 100 people can, how many people does it start to take like do you need to bootstrap like a small local business? You know, probably not that many, depends on the nature of the business, but if you like, yeah, it's kind of a one-way ratchet though, that as long as every interaction that people have kind of increase, it's like this high trust society thing.
Yes.
It's like having a high trust society just makes everything less expensive. Trust is a deflationary force, put it that way. Just like technology is deflationary, trust is deflationary.
Well, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, like, for instance, if a trivial example is like, in a high trust society, I have to pay less for security systems.
Yeah, okay.
I don't have to buy bars to put on the window of my store. I don't have to hire a security guard. I'm going to pay lower rates I'm going to have lower rates of chargeback from my customers. So trust is kind of like, I'm going to spend less time, vetting, people I work with. So yeah, trust makes life easier, and it makes things less expensive. And there are examples of places in the world that are like totalitarian places that have very high trust because everyone is terrified of getting whacked by like the big dude, you know what I mean? But that is kind of like a shitty shortcut to a high trust society. Yeah. And it's also fragile because if something happens, then you're right back to you're just Russia in the 90s after that. So the vacuum left by those kind of centralized trust creating things is not really worth what you get, I think, in hindsight. So if you create a bottom-up, resilient, stable, self-correcting, negative feedback having system where it can kind of maintain a homeostatic trust, then you have a great social asset that can be used to make life easier. Like the imminent example of this is couchsurfing.com.
Yeah.
Also, like we talked about this before, couchsurfing.com, which for anyone who doesn't know was a great website where you could just kind of stay for people with free. It was basically like, hey, you're going to a city, I want a place to crash, can I stay with you? Yeah, sure. You're probably not an axe murderer because most humans are decent. And if you have a good time, you leave a review on your profile. So when you're going to a a new city, you're like, oh, this person had 10 people that in the last 6 months, and they stayed here, and nothing bad happened to them. Great. Okay. So, and again, this was the internet in like 2010, so it was a simpler, more naive time, but still, it was great because every review on a couchsurfing profile was one little incremental step toward people not having to pay for an Airbnb when they went to a city.
Right.
And it made it marginally easier for humans to trust each other and thus benefit each other, voluntarily. So it was like a huge tragedy of mythic proportions when couchsurfing.com ran out of money, couldn't pay its bills, and got bought up by some kind of like private fund that just tried to squeeze the money out of it. And started charging people like $60 a year or something, which ruined the whole thing because most people are using it because they're broke. So it like killed it. And like, yeah, if you're living in Thailand, you probably can't afford $60, you know what I mean? It was just horrible. So that if that was built on Nostr from the get-go, okay, well, all that data is still on relays. Someone might have to rebuild the actual like HTTP or something, but the asset, the socially valuable data set, if you would have signed and published those reviews on relays, you could have resurrected couchsurfing.
Yeah.
But you didn't. So again, like I said, someone's going to build couchsurfing on Nostr if no one else does it.
It could be you.
I'm going to do it if nobody else does it. I don't think you can make money from couchsurfing. You shouldn't try to make money for couchsurfing. Couchsurfing is the purest example of a social good, and like someone's going to do it. And but that's just an example of a high trust system that, this is the humanitarian angle of selling Nostr to normies that I think more Nostr people should lean into. It's like, yes, in the back of your mind, it's about censorship resistance and like resisting like the state and all that stuff. But to the average person, if you tell a story about like, doesn't it suck that a corporation can just get deleted and then like all of this organic social interaction just goes down the drain? Yeah. That's a real shame. Wouldn't it be great if we could protect and preserve this kind of like, culture,
right?
So.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Couchsurfing is a beautiful example of that. But like, I mean, really, again, this is the beauty of the network effect at the protocol level. like that obviously brings some users who are now going to come on and review music or food or whatever. Like everything. Like eventually, you can just see like if you're not on the network effect protocol, then you die because that's where all of the reputation is occurring. Like even for something like Yelp or something similar, simple, right? Like just restaurant reviews. I would much rather be able to, for example, log in with Twitter. I'm assuming the reason this doesn't happen is because their APIs. We saw today, we were looking at other companies that were trying to do trust rankings on Twitter's graph.
Right.
I'm assuming like they've charged a lot for the API or whatever. But I would love to be able to just log in with Twitter and say like, hey, like what are my friends that I actually know, or even like log in with WhatsApp or whatever. What do they recommend? That would be super useful to me.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's so many interesting apps like this. Like in the early 2010s, one of the first ideas my buddy and I tried when we were starting a company, we were in the energy world before I got into residential solar finance in Mexico with Bright. One of our first ideas was actually to build a solar social network.
Whoa.
And so the idea of that was there's some interesting study we read that came out of the University of Texas at Austin. And I think it was this guy, Varun Rai. I don't know why I remember him now, but I do. And basically he was just showing that like solar spread incredibly strong. Like there's a super high coefficient of like if your neighbor got solar, that you were gonna get solar. Because like they would tell you about it, they would explain the tax benefits or like, whatever it was.
When was
like,
this?
This was early 2010s.
Dude, the solar social network is such a 2010s idea.
Right?
I love that. It's like such a solar punk idea. Literally, that's crazy.
Well, and so our idea was at the time,
Wow.
if we could basically, and at the time, I want to say this was like 2012, 2013.
Okay.
We wanted to build this on top of Facebook's graph. And so Facebook still had an API. I think they literally, I want to say they shut it down while we were playing with this idea. But our idea
Back
was,
when you could scrape people's like names and locations from
totally.
Facebook.
And I was so excited because I was like, okay, cool. Like
Yeah.
what we wanted to do, obviously would be
Right.
opt-in, but was to
Right.
build like a map where you could say, okay, I got solar, and I'm excited about that. I'm willing to, be at whatever a reference point for my neighbors. And,
Yeah.
oh, by the way, at that time, the business we saw as a kind of the starting point was people were getting huge referrals because the solar system was like obviously a very high ticket item, and so
Right.
they might pay you for a good lead or a closed deal like over $1,000.
Yeah.
So you could see it spreading. People were excited about it. Whatever. And then the Facebook API got shut down. We're like, okay, well, so much
Real
for
shit.
that.
Yeah.
But yeah, who knows? Actually, maybe a solar social network on Nostr could work. I mean, for people that wanted to opt in. But there's all kinds of like weird niche ideas like that,
Yeah.
or even like those ride sharing apps like BlaBlaCar and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Like honestly, I would be kind of like still scared to get in with some total rando.
Dude.
Although I guess people got over that. But like if I could say, like, oh, like whatever Stu vouches for this guy, like, for sure.
Man, I've had an idea for a long time. It's kind of like half a joke, but also half serious. It's just like a thing that was basically just like shitty Uber.
Yeah.
That was like Uber, like you can't even be a part of this version. You cannot join this ride sharing app if your car is newer than 1999. Your car has to be at least 25 years old.
I love it.
You like this app is like free, like wink wink, otherwise known as cash only.
Yeah.
Like this is not a business. This is just people giving rides to other people voluntarily. Like there's no taxes, there's no regulation. Get the fuck out of here. I'm gonna pick up a dude. I'm perfectly within my rights to give. I can give like a random hitchhiker a ride, okay? Get out of here with your regulation. And I really think that kind of completely unhinged, unregulated Uber would be better than your average taxi company, because the incentives to participate are just like the incentives for couch surfing. Give a ride, get a ride. And it's not enforced by anyone, but it's like, if you have nothing to do, maybe you can give some people a ride in your hometown, and then they leave you a review. Thanks a lot. They're probably not a bot because they have a social graph, and you can, go back to the nth degree and see if they're actually a bot. An algorithm can even probably do that for you. But anyways, whatever. You have some type of person who maybe when you go to a new city, you can just like get a free ride. And it's kind of free, not really, but you pay for it in terms of the social capital that you've built up giving other people rides. And it's just like how humans interact, like individually. Like if you go up to someone and ask them for a favor, They don't like pull out like an accountant's book and be like, let's see here. Oh, you're like $10 in the red, man. Sorry, I can't do anything for you. They just have a general unconscious idea of like, yeah, why not? You're a decent person. So we already have a decentralized social credit score. You know, in America, we have in all human societies have social credit. It's just decentralized and permissionless and not controlled by a centralized entity. Whereas on the other hand, this is back to that thing of like all the things that are dystopian are only dystopian because they're centralized.
Right.
Like, you know, we also have like the Xi Jinping Chinese Communist Party AI face recognition, like, no, sorry, you can't buy a plane ticket because you did a bad thing kind of social credit score. Okay, that's horribly dystopian, but like that's just because it's centralized.
Right.
And I really think that the lesson is like, if you don't build the decentralized version of a thing that's needed, what you're doing is you're creating a power vacuum and you're leaving the door open for someone to come along and convince people to accept the centralized version because it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, again, if you have a bunch of, it's like if local police don't do their job, then you have like a higher level of the government sends in their people who are even less connected to the community. It's similar to that. Like, if you don't keep your own house in order, you're just inviting someone else to do it for you.
That's a great, I love that. And it's so true. It's like, it's kind of what you were saying earlier, that Nostr is a way of just rebuilding what's always existed in, you know, meat space.
Yeah, it's a way of creating ultimately hyper-localism for things that were not formally, for like practical, functional reasons, not able to be made local.
And also a way
Yeah.
to take social capital that you can build locally, but like you said, you can actually potentially cash that in or use it internationally.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that social capital is very hard to tax.
Yeah.
Because you can't represent it. It's fuzzy. It's like you can't. If I'm a nice dude and I just do things for free.
I'm sorry, Stu. I'm gonna have to take 10% of your niceness over here.
Yeah, like, oh, you're a nice guy. Like, you owe us some money. Don't give them any ideas.
I know exactly.
By the way, anyone listening to this in the future, this is hypothetical and for entertainment purposes only.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Stu's actually an asshole, all right? Like,
I mean, if you got rid of income tax, you wouldn't have to worry about this kind of thing. But that's a whole different
that's
story.
a whole different story.
Yeah.
But I do love that idea though, like the decentralized Uber thing. And by the way, have you met Christopher David?
No.
If you haven't, you should meet him. He's in Austin. He's now working on this open agents thing, which is pretty wild. But
What is it called?
Open agents.
Open
it's like,
agents?
Yeah. The idea is anyone. It's basically like
TaskRabbit?
open AI, but like actually open. So
Oh.
whatever they do, he just clones it, and like anyone can launch a bot, get paid out in Bitcoin.
That's cool.
Yeah, it actually is very cool. But he actually built in Austin the largest cooperative Uber, and I think it might even still be running. But it ran.
Oh, what
for
the hell?
like
So this
5+
exists. Someone he
years.
made this already.
He made it already. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
in fact,
cool.
his first thing getting into Nostr was he was going to rebuild it on Nostr.
Dude.
Realized it was too early. Then he was going to build local Bitcoins and a chat app on Nostr. Then he got sucked into AI and like, you know, whatever, which I think was probably right given the timing, but eventually both of those should exist.
Okay, so he's way ahead of this. That's. I'm glad someone's doing this. That's awesome.
But no one's doing it. I mean, he's not doing it on Nostr yet. Someone needs to, though. So.
Yeah.
So kind of a question I think about sometimes, like as I, you know, wear just my like human being hat, I love all of this. As I wear my investor hat, I think sometimes, like, do you think then, like, that the age of like any kind of large companies is over, that everything's going to go hyper local? Or do you think there will still be relatively large businesses? Or how do you think all of that plays out 20 years into Nostr, or 25, 30 years?
Man, I don't know. That's a good question. What do you think?
I think there's still going to be, I don't think there will be, so I think that there will be bigger businesses in absolute terms, but smaller in percentage terms. At least that's my starting point. What I mean by that is kind of what you were saying. I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary until you put it like this, but trust being deflationary.
Yeah.
In the sense that there's less tax on all economic activity. So in theory, your GDP should be much bigger, right?
Yes.
GDP should be much bigger in a high trust environment because people can just like do shit and like create value.
Yeah.
Like the more time you're spending, you know, second guessing or
Right.
buying security or whatever, like the less time you're actually just like doing valuable things.
Right.
And so,
And high trust societies, decentralized high trust systems are more resistant to tyranny
exactly.
because it's harder to convince people to, you know, go against and alienate people that they trust.
So one way I think about that then is like, and this was the first kind of my thesis on the Lightning Network, and now it's similar to Nostr, is like, you know, bigger pie, lower take rate, still bigger business.
Oh, and that's what you mean in terms of lower by percentage. In terms of, like, so yeah, you have to grow, when you grow the market, you have bigger absolutes, but less relative.
Exactly. So
Right.
to make a simple example, whatever, let's say Facebook and Apple, the FANG companies or whatever,
Right.
or I don't even know what they are as a percentage of U.S. or world GDP now, but
Right.
let's say 10% or 20% or whatever, like some large
Yeah.
percentage. I don't think any small set of businesses ever get that big as a percentage again. But if global GDP goes 100x,
Yeah.
and you take 1% because you're whatever the and as an example here, I think you have a lot less lock-in, but there will still be competition. If you just like produce the best, you produce the best. Now that could change over time. You have less like, oh, we're going to be the best 25 years out. In fact, I would expect much higher turnover, and as companies become less excellent. But if you're excellent, you're still excellent, right? And so, one example here is like, imagine you have a marketplace. This is actually a thing I want right now. So if anyone's listening to this, and I know a lot of the companies I work with want this too, which is the API for trust. And just to be able to be saying, the example I gave here was, I'm listening, I'm giving an ad on Fountain, or I'm giving a promotion where you have 1,000 stats for your first listen. I need you to tell me if this person is, a human or a bot.
Yeah.
And that's the web of what you call web of not spam. But then I might have more highly specific things. It's like, okay, cool. I want to, I don't know, get some trust scoring algorithm to decide if I should let this person in my house or whatever. I think there is a chance, I think there's going to be a long tail of those, but there'll probably still be a fat tail too. And there's still going to be like some that do the algorithms better. And again, better is a relative term because everyone's from a different point of view. So I don't think there's like an absolute best, but I still think all kinds of products, some things will have better interfaces, some things will have better brands, some things just may have better algorithms or more useful algorithms for certain people. Then you're also always going to have the ability to monetize on payments, which is, even if the Lightning Network payment fees, like extra fees go to 0%, there's still like a scarcity in that Bitcoin is scarce.
Right.
And the position of your routing node and the reputation it has within the Lightning Network is scarce.
Yeah.
So there's ways to monetize there. I guess another way of saying this is like, in a world where, the software becomes abundant or free, and AI is going to push for that, and the data is open, and the reputation is open. Maybe not exactly open because you still have to build the algorithms to use it, and that's potentially one area to compete. What is scarce in that world? And Bitcoin is scarce.
Yeah, reputation is scarce.
Reputation is scarce. So one thing I was actually talking about a couple months ago with DK is maybe the big businesses is not actually the software businesses at all. Maybe like the big businesses is just like the actual quote unquote content creators, like the best writers or the best music producers. Like maybe artists actually make the most money as well.
Yeah, I think people that have, like, I mean, it sounds super cliche, but I think vision is going to become super fucking important. And like, maybe to put it more specifically, like, what do I mean by vision? Maybe you could even look at that somewhat reductively as like, you could reduce vision almost to priorities. Like, and the reason, if you reduce it to priorities, you can see it a little clearer when you start thinking about how, like, you start contrasting and how like an LLM and a human, what the things they can do. Like, you can automate, you can imagine a future in which all the things, like if you're running a business, you can try to offload and automate and delegate to LLMs all the tasks that require intelligence. And in the limit, you're going to be able to have, maybe the CEO is a one-man corporation. He can sort of like...
I think that's coming, by the way.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And he's going to, I mean, at that point, it's like, do you even need a corporation? Or are you just, everyone's a sole proprietor for tax reasons, and we all have just an army of AI employees that are totally not employees. They're just software, man.
It's just it's just speech, man. Code speech, bro.
Code speech, bro.
Yeah.
You don't pay Social Security for my LLM here, no.
Yeah.
So, I mean, hopefully, man, but that would be a funny outcome, wouldn't it? But, yeah, so where was I going with that? Yeah, so if you imagine that kind of like one person company, what becomes important, the thing that cannot be automated is priorities of knowing what to do and in what order to do it. That is like, if you ask an AI to do that, I guess we've entered into a new metaphysical dimension of what life even is, right? Like, because as far as I know, like right now, AIs don't want anything. Like, you have to want something. Like, even ordering of priorities, you could argue like, well, that is an intelligence-based task. Yes, if you define the metrics for what you're trying to get, well, what are those metrics? Well, what do you want?
So I
You know what I'm saying? What are you trying to accomplish? Like, values are a distinctly human thing.
Well, this is what I was going to
So,
say when you said
yeah.
this. Like, for me, it's priorities. I mean, maybe like that's part of it, but less that. It's more of just like desires and imagination.
Yes, yeah. Like, priorities are downstream of desires, and doing actual work is downstream of priorities.
Yes.
So ultimately, it's all downstream of human desire, humanity itself. And so, by definition, there is limits to what we can automate away. And so, yeah, maybe the person who has the most noble desire in the future is going to be the richest person in the world.
Or the least noble desire, based on the way things have gone in the last 50
shit.
years. Yeah.
Well, no, I guess, yeah, ultimately it comes down to whether you think humans are good or bad. And I think humans are good, and that honestly, the biggest lie that everyone ever convinced themselves is that we're all just damned from the get-go. That's the most toxic idea Western civilization has. Original sin is the most toxic thing about Western civilization.
Why do you say that?
Because it basically it primes people to give away their power because they've been convinced that they can't be trusted with it. And because you're a bad person, you have to give away your power. And that's what original sin primes people to think, is that like those who seek power are evil. And that is just so, I think that's tragic, because like, so what does that mean? It means that you're leaving the door open for people who have no such scruples to gain power. If you, like, the only kind of person who deserves power is someone who, like, I mean, everyone, like if people don't try to gain power in the world, basically what they're saying is that your vision isn't worthy of coming into being. And if you think that isn't the case, then, well, it makes me think of like that Alan Watts quote. That's sort of like, it's analogous to this idea. Alan Watts says like, anyone who thinks they need to go to the psychiatrist should have their head examined. It's like this idea that like almost that like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you think that you're like bad, if you think that you're not worthy, then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're calling that attitude is calling into being that kind of thing. So if you're afraid to be like, I want this, so I'm going to try to get it. But if you have like this seed of doubt in yourself that like, well, no, that probably I'm a selfish person. It's like, no, you're undermining yourself, and you're leaving it open for someone who's like Machiavellian, like, yes, I'm evil and I don't care and I'm just going to do this. Like, why are the, what's that saying? Like, the whole problem with the world is that, fools are so confident while the wise so full of doubt.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, how do we solve that situation? Well, maybe remove the thing that makes people doubt themselves, which is like baked into the metaphysics of Western civilization. It's like the idea that like life is one big like
punishment.
Like you have to somehow like, it's like the Kafka-esque thing. Like in Kafka's most dystopian thing was like a world where everyone's main preoccupation is trying to figure out what they did wrong. Like it's this kind of like inscrutable matrix of like trying to like, it's like seeking for permission or seeking for some sort of like approval. I mean, it's basically like what college does to people now. Like it's just a sort of recapitulation of this kind of like permissioned system.
Yep.
And incidentally, the only times you see like growth and inspiration and beauty and stuff is like systems where growth just like outruns the capacity of those systems, those permission systems, to sort of like impose themselves upon the new medium, like the internet. The reason why all GDP growth of like a lot of the disproportionate amount of GDP was concentrated in computers was because they were just like impractical to regulate.
Just unregulated, yeah.
They were it's like not because people, not for lack of trying, but just for lack of success.
Yeah.
And so
same with cryptography. Like
yeah,
anything
same
we're
with
doing in Nostr world.
yeah.
Or
So like
world,
hurry up. Like speed is your friend.
Yeah.
The faster you do things, the less you're gonna have to fight against people whose main job is to try to like make things
Slow you
impossible.
down.
Yeah. And I don't know, like people get like super militant about this, and I try to keep a sense of humor about it, because there's something inevitable about just like, there's a push and pull between the takers and the makers. I mean, people have said this for decades. It's the kind of tension that underlies a lot of the modern world, is this kind of like destabilizing, like, I guess the ACK people, the whatever the, what is it?
EAC.
EAC, yeah. The AI version of this is people who are just like the kind of like all gas, no brakes kind of people. Like,
Yeah.
I like that. There's something at least
do I.
honest about that.
Yeah.
There's something like, because truthfully is like, everything, the world, reality is all gas. There's no version of this reality in which things slow down. And so like, I appreciate the kind of like little like toast to realism that the EAC people have, because it's not so much an ideology as just a recognition of how things are. Like, you cannot control this force. You cannot stop it. So we're either going to have the Mordor version unless we hurry up and build the non-Mordor version.
Totally. Well, and one way I've always thought about this, and I'm curious your thoughts on the limits of market intelligence, but markets only being a part of this, but I've always thought the kind of EAC philosophy is essentially just like Taoism. It's just basically saying like, look, like, don't try and moralize, just accept what is.
Yeah.
And accept that what is, to the extent that there is good or bad. I mean, you can still have a moral compass within there for sure, but the act of second guessing yourself and like trying to like just fight against reality. It's like there's a Buckminster Fuller quote I love, which is, instead of trying to fight forces, just use them and go with them, basically. And that to me was always also this very Taoist, like, identify what is and go with it.
That's judo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The gentle way.
What do you think on that? I mean, well, actually, before we jump in that, another question that you sparked in my mind. How do you think, I mean, you talk about sort of all gas, and yet we're sitting here on a lovely day here in Chico, and like, obviously I think both of us certainly appreciate time for thought, contemplation.
Right.
How do you think about this just kind of like, I don't know, like personally and like layering in life? It's something I think a lot about, which is, on the one hand, there are times, and maybe there's periods of like fucking all gas, go, and periods where I do really just truly enjoy watching the universe do its thing and not being as forceful in there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that all gas thing is kind of a
no time for sleep, man.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of why I say I like to keep a sense of humor about it, because like, on a personal level, I mean, everything is like, what's the saying? Like, the path to truth is usually the integration of opposites. Talk about Taoism. That's a very Taoistic idea. Is like, if you see some kind of apparent contradiction, usually you can find an insight by attempting to create an integration of the two things that are seemingly opposite. Like, for instance, like, like an example of this would be, well, I'll back up for a second. So it's like, the crucial point is that integration is not, it's the integration of opposites, not a compromise between opposites, because integration is not the same thing as compromise. Compromise implies a kind of lessening of at least one of the things, whereas integration implies no such lessening, but it does demand a creative act to synthesize cleverly the things that seem to be opposite, so that you can create something new in a somewhat orthogonal dimension. And so an example of like, maybe how do you integrate the EAC lifestyle with like the like maybe like kind of like chill normal dude lifestyle? Like, I don't know, man, but people are trying, and like in practice you see that people who do crazy stuff are usually, on a personal level, like, almost to survive, have to be kind of even keeled, because if they weren't, they would self-destruct.
Explode,
They would just spin out, and plenty of people do, but you just don't see those people.
Yeah, exactly.
And like, so I don't know. There's a kind of like there's a kind of natural integration that happens, and you're only you only see online. You only see a projection of what people are trying to project. You don't meet people in real life.
Right.
That's why people are so much nicer in real life, is because
I found the exact same thing.
Dude, because online everyone is a caricature,
Right.
and like a caricature is necessarily like extreme, and you just have
Well, it's also interesting there to that point, like, even though Nostr and the Web of Trust we built is a nice model, it's going to be, a vast shadow of like spending a day with someone, right?
right.
But obviously that doesn't count.
Yeah.
So models are not the territory, but they can be useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
You want to call it?
Yeah, I feel like we talked. I feel like we can do this for a long time.
Yeah,
more,
man, that was awesome.
Yeah.
we I hope we got some of that audio.
I do too.